Fierce, giant, and extinct. Okay, you're probably thinking of a dinosaur, right? Maybe a T-Rex or one of those long-necked dudes. But what if I say no dinosaurs allowed? Then your brain might jump to a giant flying pterosaur, a sea monster, a massive croc, a megalodon, or maybe a beast from the Ice Age. The point is, when we talk about giant prehistoric monsters, a few key players always steal the spotlight, which is why you see the same handful of creatures in every documentary and movie. But because everyone's so focused on the A-listers, a bunch of other giants that once roamed the Earth have been totally sidelined, overshadowed by the same old fan favorites. And you know what? I think these forgotten freaks of nature deserve some love too. Because if you actually dig through history, you'll find there were tons of giants stomping around that most people have never ever heard of. And I'm not talking about some obscure cousin of a T-Rex or a weird type of mammoth. Nope. Today we're diving into the deep cuts animals you probably didn't even know could exist. Case in point, this thing, now known as the Beast of Lulutu. If you've actually heard of this guy, your prehistoric knowledge is legendary, and you might not even need this video. But hey, stick around for the fun. Now, for everybody else, what in the world is the Beast of Lulutu? Simple. It's an amphibian that broke all the rules. For hundreds of millions of years, from way back in the Carboniferous period all the way to the Cretaceous, you could say one group basically ran the amphibian world. They were called the temnospondyls, and these critters were everywhere, in every shape and size you can imagine. Some were tiny, and others were absolutely monstrous. I mean, this group was insanely diverse. Think of them like the early experimental version of mammals, a ton of different models for every occasion. So it's no surprise there were a bunch of different families in this group, and one of them was the Brachiopods, a family that showed up near the end of the Permian period and did pretty well for themselves until the Jurassic. The members of this squad, just like the bigger group, came in all sizes and lived all over, but they all had one thing in common. They were carnivores that probably lived a lot like modern crocodiles, total opportunists who would eat anything that fit in their mouths. For the longest time, scientists thought the amphibians from this family were basically small to medium-sized predators. Nothing huge. That is, until they dug up a busted piece of a jaw in South Africa. And that one bone fragment changed everything, because this thing's mouthpiece was enormous. Now, they're still not sure if it belongs to a species we already know about or a totally new one. But one thing's for sure, it came from one of these brachiopoid amphibians. And when you compare this jaw piece to its relatives, you get a creature that might have stretched 23 feet long. That's 7 meters. For comparison, the biggest amphibian alive today, the Chinese giant salamander, is only about 5.6 feet long. So this ancient beast was more than 3 times its size. And the Beast of Lulutu wasn't just long, it was built like a tank, super chunky and powerful, with a massive mouth that could have probably swallowed a person whole, and it likely weighed several tons. The body, I mean, not just the mouth. Right now, the theory is that it lurked in the rivers and lakes of the Elliott Formation way back in the early Jurassic, where it probably scared the heck out of all sorts of animals that came down for a drink, including dinosaurs like theropods, early sauropods, and ornithischians. And get this, so far, it's the biggest known carnivore from that entire fossil site, and that includes the dinosaurs. So much for this being the age of dinosaurs, huh? But I gotta be honest, the jaw piece is just a fragment, so we're still waiting to see just how spot on that massive size estimate really is. But hey, even if the Beast of Lulutu turns out to be a bit smaller, it's cool, because we have other obscure giant amphibians to talk about. Like the Prionosuchus, which might have been even longer, though a bit more slender, and hailed from Permian era. Brazil, or how about the alligator-faced Mastodonsaurus from Triassic Europe, which could have topped 20 feet or 6 meters long. That thing was way more heavily built and made a great living munching on giant fish and, its own kind. Yep, we have solid evidence that this 2-ton-plus monster was a cannibal. Yikes. So, next time a TV show or movie wants to make a prehistoric swamp feel truly terrifying, I say forget the crocodiles and bring in one of these giant amphibians. They are just that awesome. And you know what else is awesome? A giant animal that looks like a dinosaur, but wasn't. And it's something most people have never even heard of. So, what am I talking about? None other than the Silasaurus, of course. Now, if you're a longtime fan of the channel, you might recognize this guy. But I still think it's a super unknown creature to most people, which is just crazy when you realize this was the largest animal to ever walk on 2 legs that wasn't a dinosaur. I know. It's tough to wrap your head around, but believe me, This absolute unit was not a dinosaur. Seriously. What you're looking at is a poposauroid, which was basically part of an advanced squad of reptiles that were one of the most common critters on Earth. Back in the Triassic period, these guys were famous for being, well, weird. Some had sails on their backs, others were built like brick houses on 4 legs, and then you had ones like Silasaurus here, strutting around on 2 feet. This beast, the Silasaurus, was part of a family called the Shuvasauridae. And surprise, surprise, it was the biggest one in the family, and one of the largest non-dinosaurs to ever stomp the planet. We've found bones showing it could hit 33 feet long. Let me put that in perspective. That's longer than your average fully grown Allosaurus. And I'm going to say it one more time for the people in the back. This was times, not times a theropod. But what makes this animal even crazier is that while it looks like a total monster movie meat-eater, it was actually just a gentle giant. Well, a gentle giant when it came to its diet anyway. It was a plant eater with a beak and no teeth, nibbling on trees like some kind of 2-legged brontosaurus. And funny enough, it actually hung out with early sauropods, or at least their cousins. This beast is from the Triassic Ischigualasto formation in Argentina, which had plenty of dinosaurs, but none of them were giants yet. That means this guy was likely the biggest thing in its neighborhood. Now, as cool as that is, I've got to mention that its meat-eating relatives were just as ridiculously huge. Take the pseudosuchian known as Fasolasuchus, which was just as long, but way more toothy, and probably a whole lot angrier. It likely specialized in hunting down those multi-ton early sauropod types. In fact, it looks like Fasolasuchus might have been the biggest land predator ever if you take dinosaurs out of the equation, and the largest land hunter to walk on all 4s. So, with a resume like that, it's no wonder it finally got its Hollywood moment in the movie 65. But let's be clear, it definitely did not live 65 million years ago like the movie wants you to think. Nope. Just like Silasaurus, it was a star of the late Triassic. But you know what's still waiting for its big break as a movie monster? A creature that I think would give Jaws a run for its money, the Nothosaurus. This was just one type of a totally forgotten group of marine reptiles, appropriately named Nothosaurs, who swam in oceans all over the globe for most of the Triassic period. In a lot of ways, they looked like a rough draft of the plesiosaurs, with long bodies, stretchy necks, flippers, and slender builds. And usually they ate the same stuff, using a mouthful of needle-like teeth to snatch up fish and other squirmy things. Yet, for some reason, they've stayed totally off the radar compared to their famous cousins. I think it's because plesiosaurs got way, way bigger, while nothosaurs were usually pretty small. They typically maxed out around 6.5 feet. So, big enough to make you jump out of your skin in the water, but probably not big enough to actually drag you under. However, that whole idea about their size started getting tossed out the window after some massive fossils turned up in Triassic-era China and Europe. These new discoveries, mostly pieces of their faces, and different teeth, showed that 2 species could grow up to 23 feet long and were built way tougher than their smaller relatives. This has got scientists thinking that fish probably wasn't the only thing on the menu for these brutes. For one of the new species, they even think the current size estimates are too small and that it could have gotten even bigger. Now, look, I get it. We've been spoiled by ocean giants like the megalodon and killer whales. But don't forget, even at 23 feet, the Nothosaurus is one of the biggest marine predators that wasn't a whale, mosasaur, plesiosaur, ichthyosaur, or a shark. And yeah, that might sound like a long list of exceptions, but think about just how many different groups of creatures have lived in the sea. And what makes the Nothosaurus a little more terrifying is that, unlike its lookalike, the plesiosaur, it was apparently a semi-aquatic animal. You could find it not just in the water, but also lurking on the beaches. If you don't mind sharing the sand with a predator longer than a tiger shark that also has a face that looks like total nightmare fuel, then the Nothosaurus might be your perfect beach buddy. And like I said, the Nothosaurus came from the Triassic period, just like the other monsters we've talked about so far. And that's why I'd say the Triassic has flown completely under the radar as an age of giants, because it was packed with them. And out of all of them, there was one land-based tank that is almost never mentioned, even though it might have been the biggest land animal ever if you take out dinosaurs, elephants, and rhinos from the running. And pretty much nobody knows it exists. I'm talking about the Lissawisha. Now, part of the reason it's flying so far under the radar is that it's the new kid on the block that was only officially described back in 2019. But the crazy part is, The bones belonging to this beast were actually dug up way earlier. All the way back in 2006, researchers in Poland found a wild collection of bones outside a little village called Lisasaurus. And these things were absolutely massive. So huge, in fact, that the scientists first figured they had to belong to some kind of giant, long-necked dinosaur. But then they hit the jackpot, finding over 1,000 more bones. And this time, they found pieces of a skull. That's when they realized they'd stumbled onto something totally different. A brand new kind of dicynodont, a weirdo cousin of early mammals. Yeah, you heard that right, it was related to mammals, not dinosaurs. Now, this group of animals was already a well-known part of the Triassic period, with some big players already on the board, like Ixigualastia from Argentina. And that guy was no slouch. It could weigh up to a ton and stand nearly as tall as a person. But the Lisavicia was on a whole other level. It made all the others look like toddlers. Its hips alone stood over 8.5 feet tall, and its body stretched out for over 15 feet. And that's just the body, people! We're not even counting a tail, mainly because it barely had one. This thing was just pure, concentrated bulk. And because it was basically a walking, oversized blob, its bones were ridiculously thick and strong, which put the Lisavicia at a mind-blowing 9 tons. That's in the same league as modern elephants, and it was heavier than rock stars like Stegosaurus and Ankylosaurus. And remember, this absolute unit was stomping around during the Triassic. Because of that insane size, some experts think it was the biggest land animal on the entire planet before the giant long-necked dinosaurs showed up. How cool is that? But don't worry, all you would-be time travelers, this guy wasn't a meat eater like some of the other giants we've talked about. Lisavicia was a plant muncher with a toothless beak that it used to snip and chew on all kinds of vegetation. And we know what it ate, because we found its coprolites. Yep, it's fossilized poop! The evidence shows it was mostly eating soft plants and conifers, but it wasn't afraid to snack on some tough, woody stuff either. But even though it was a salad lover, I would still keep a healthy distance, because this thing was, again, built like a literal tank. It had a thick, bony head that I'm positive could do some serious damage if it decided you looked at it funny. I mean, a modern camel can basically bite a person's head clean off. I really don't want to find out what a 9-ton dicynodont could do, but even being that huge wasn't a get-out-of-jail-free card back in the Triassic. We've actually found Lisavicia bones with bite marks on them, and they seem to have come from another obscure giant, the Smok-Wawelski, and yes, that is its actual awesome name. Now, this Smok character was a pretty big predator from the late Triassic that kinda looked like it could have been a dinosaur, or maybe some other weird reptile. For now, we're not totally sure what it was, only that it was a monster for its time, measuring in at 6 meters, or 20 feet long. That actually makes it the biggest known meat-eating archosaur from Europe, not just in the late Triassic, but all the way into the early Jurassic. So at this point, everything I've mentioned has been distinctly not a mammal, which is what we are. And maybe you're feeling a little left out of the giant monster party. And to be honest, finding truly obscure giant mammals is tricky, because a lot of them are just the same old story. I mean, sure, you could talk about Paraceratherium or the straight-tusked elephant, both 10-plus ton monsters, but one was basically a giant rhino and the other was a giant elephant. Those two groups are not obscure. They're famous for being enormous. So, in my book, that doesn't really count as obscure. Then you've got your Ice Age celebrities, like the giant ground sloths and car-sized armadillos. Super cool, but everybody knows about them. But after all that digging, there was one group that really jumped out at me. They aren't as famous as the Ice Age crew, and they got to sizes that, frankly, I didn't even know was possible. I'm talking about the Brontotheres. If I had to sum up this family of extinct odd-toed ungulates, I'd just call them the original rhinos. But here's the twist. They only looked like rhinos on the surface. They weren't close relatives at all. In fact, they were actually a little more related to horses. Their similar look was just a classic case of convergent evolution. I guess having a tank-like body, a thick hide, and a giant bony horn on your nose to smash things with is a pretty sweet setup no matter what family you come from. And as a group, just like rhinos, these guys were total rock stars of their time, surviving for over 20 million years and throwing a massive party all over the planet, across Europe, North America, and Asia. It's thought they rolled deep in huge herds, chilling out in warm, swampy forests. Now, the brainiacs who study these creatures have known for ages that some of them got absolutely massive. And for the longest time, the heavyweight champ was a beast called Megacerops, a true giant even among its own kind. that stood 2.5 meters, or a whopping 8.2 feet tall at the shoulder, and stretched over 15 feet long, even with its stubby tail. This dude was a homegrown American legend from the late Eocene, and was one of the very first land animals to hit 5 tons after the dinosaurs punched out. And at that size, especially when you consider the kind of predators running around back then, it's believed the grown-ups were completely off the menu, nothing could touch them. I'm sure it helped that they looked like something out of a nightmare, thanks to those gnarly double horns on their face.
In this summary
but hold
of
on,
the Brontotheriidae
because this is where the story gets
we
nuts.
illustrate the diverse
As huge as
morphology and
Megacerops
scale
was
of
for a
the 8
mammal,
primary
it might not have
species.
even been the biggest of its family. In fact, it's possible it wasn't even in the same weight class as an even more obscure cousin. Meet Embolotherium. This was a super close relative, but it was actually older, hanging out in Mongolia about 3 million years before Megacerops even showed up to the party. And this monster isn't some new discovery. Truth is, scientists have always had a hunch that Embolotherium was the real king of the Brontotheres. But the chatter about it being the biggest ever didn't really kick off until they unearthed a titanic skull back in the mid-70s. This thing was a fragment, and the piece alone was over 4 feet, or 1.22 meters long, maybe even longer. That's not just bigger than the skull of a modern elephant, it was getting into T-Rex territory. So, it was pretty clear to the researchers that they had an absolute monster on their hands. And even though it's tough to know exactly how huge it was without the rest of the body, some guess this massive head belonged to an animal pushing 9 tons, stretching anywhere from 18 to 20 feet long, or 5.4 to 6 meters. It would have been so tall that if you stood next to it, you'd have to crane your neck and look straight up at the sky just to see its face. And aside from being ridiculously huge, this beast had a pretty unique horn that looked less like a horn and more like a battering ram welded to its face. Now, at first, this made everyone think that, just like a ram, Embolotherium used this thing to smash up any threats and to headbutt rivals for dominance. But when scientists actually studied these rams, they noticed that compared to its relatives, this one was way thinner and more hollow, which led to a totally new theory. They weren't weapons at all. They were probably for communication, maybe to make their calls super loud and deep, while their absolutely insane size was all the defense they needed. There you have it, one seriously underrated prehistoric giant. But the crazy thing is, Embolotherium and its family aren't the only forgotten titans. There are so many others. And if we flip over to the world of carnivores, there's one animal that's so shocking it has a real shot at being crowned the largest mammalian predator of all time. Well, one that isn't a whale anyway. And this mystery beast is kinda linked to a living giant you probably underestimate, the walrus. Okay, obviously, most people have heard of a walrus. At least, I really hope you have. But what many people don't realize is just how unbelievably big they are. To give you some perspective, a big male walrus is often 2 or 3 times heavier than a freaking polar bear, and sports insane tusks that can each be 100 centimeters or 3.3 feet long. And yet, even at that insane size, today's walruses are basically the runts of the family. Yeah, you heard that right, because in the past, there was a much bigger, now extinct walrus that once ruled the seas. It didn't just dwarf other walruses, it's a top contender for the biggest meat eater to ever live. Its name? Pontolis Magnus. To find this beast, we'd have to rewind the clock about 12 million years. This was a time when the oceans were basically a non-stop horror movie, packed with not just megalodon, but also killer whales the size of buses and all sorts of other monsters. And swimming among them was our boy, Pontolis Magnus, an absolute titan that stretched over 4 meters, or 13 feet long, and tipped the scales at up to 4 tons, the same as a male Asian elephant. And the biggest ones might have been even heavier than that. But let me repeat, this was not an elephant. This was a 4-ton freaking walrus. And while Asian elephants are all about their greens, Pontolis Magnus was basically the Ron Swanson of the sea. This thing was a pure meat eater, an active, terrifying predator. But get this, unlike the walruses we know today with their giant tusks, Pontolis didn't have any. Instead, it had a titanic skull that was a whopping 2 times bigger than a modern walrus's head, and inside that massive skull, it was packed with huge, powerful teeth, built for one thing: piercing and crushing giant prey. So let's be real. If you were splashing around back in its heyday, Pontolis Magnus would have seen you as a very interesting new snack. And if this beast was still swimming around today, we'd have a major problem on our hands. See, modern walruses hang out in remote, chilly parts of the world. But this monster preferred spots that are now jam-packed with people, living all along the US, west coast from California up to Oregon, and in those waters, it's thought that it hunted pretty much everything. Other seals, crabs, birds, small whales, huge fish, and oh, by the way, baby megalodons, and maybe even members of a totally extinct group of sea mammals, the desmostilians, which I actually made a video about. So if you haven't seen that one, go check it out after this. And don't you dare think that just because it was big and bulky you could have outswum it. I mean, modern walruses look like they can't swim that well either. But even though they look like giant blubbery couch potatoes, they can hit speeds up to 35 kilometers per hour, or 22 miles per hour. That is more than 3 times faster than Michael Phelps at his absolute peak, and way faster than the average person can sprint. And yeah, we're talking about sprinting on land. So, creatures like Pontolis Magnus are a great reminder that huge, open bodies of water, like seas and oceans, are basically a giant note. But hey, don't go thinking you're safe in freshwater. It's had its own share of forgotten giants. I mean, have you ever seen the show River Monsters? And one prehistoric fish that drives this point home is Risodus.
Remarkably
now,
long,
this creature is kind of on the edge of being obscure versus being sort of well-known. But its story is insane because we're talking about a killer freshwater fish that was bigger than a great white shark. And let me say it again, it was not a shark. It was actually a rhizodont, which is a group of lobe-finned fish. And Risodus was the undisputed king of that family by a mile. We've found fossils of this monster fish that were up to 7 meters, or 23 feet long, and might have weighed 1.5 tons, making it a serious contender for the biggest freshwater fish of all time. And it should come as no surprise that it lived during the Carboniferous period, the age of giant bugs and creepy amphibians lurking in the tangled, murky rivers of North America, England, and Russia. And with a body that big, it was hunting huge fish and any four-legged critters foolish enough to go near the water, using some seriously nasty teeth. See, every Risodus had these massive, fang-like tusks that could grow, longer than the tooth of a T-Rex. That means it wasn't just swallowing prey whole. Risodus could attack, kill, and then rip its victims into smaller, more manageable pieces. And just to make this thing even more of a nightmare, paleontologists realized that its front fins were way more developed and powerful than its back ones, which means you weren't even safe on the riverbank. The idea is that, just like a crocodile, Risodus could launch itself out of the water to snatch animals from the shoreline in a terrifying surprise attack. So, one second you're admiring your reflection in the water, and the next, a face as big as your whole body is exploding out and dragging you under. Yup, just one more reason the Carboniferous period is an absolute no thanks from me. But that wasn't the only time freshwater was home to forgotten monsters. If you hop over to the Cretaceous period, you find an even more obscure animal that was just as big, and possibly even bigger, than Risodus. And that animal would be Mawsonia. I'm willing to bet you've never heard of this fish, but you might know its family, the coelacanths. They're the ones that made headlines a while back for reappearing after we thought they went extinct with the dinosaurs. And while we now know it was wrong to call that whole group extinct, it's fair to say they were thriving back in the Cretaceous. They were way more diverse and lived all over the world. And Mawsonia, specifically, was found in both brackish and freshwater rivers all over South America, Eastern North America, and Africa, where it actually swam alongside the legendary Spinosaurus, who you've probably heard of and who was one of the largest meat-eating dinosaurs ever. But we're here for the fish, not the dino. And while it wasn't as big as Spinosaurus, Mawsonia was still a giant, measuring up to 4 to 8 meters, or almost 18 feet long. That's longer than the average giraffe is tall. So, it might not have set any records for length, but where Mawsonia really threw its weight around literally was in the heavyweight division. Unlike other lanky sea monsters, Mawsonia was just built thick all over, with the biggest ones possibly tipping the scales at over 2 tons. And get this, based on the wild size differences in its modern relatives, some experts think there could have been an absolute beast of a Mawsonia out there, a nearly 20-footer, all of which brings us to the big question. What on earth do you feed a fish that weighs more than 2 polar bears smashed together? And the wild part is, we're not totally sure. Judging by its teeth, one theory is that this fish loved a good crunch, chowing down on hard-shelled animals like giant crabs, huge snails, and more. But then there's the much more terrifying idea that Mosonia hunted like a modern Goliath grouper. This basically means it was a giant, swimming Kirby, using insane suction to just inhale anything that could fit in its mouth. And considering we've seen today's times, much smaller times groupers slurp down 5-foot sharks, I seriously don't want to imagine what would happen if a person swam too close to a Mosonia. So, yeah, probably best to just stay out of the water. But here's the kicker. Mosonia wasn't the only undiscovered giant in its neighborhood. There were a ton of others where that came from. This is all to say that while we all have our favorite A-list prehistoric monsters, they were far from the only game in town. And if this video blows up with enough likes, you can bet there's going to be a part 2. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time on Extinsu.